So what we're going to do in these 4 different class sections is we're going to discuss today history and method of ecology. I'm going to talk very briefly about the history of ecology and very briefly about how ecologists do things to understand the distribution and abundance of species, all right? And then most of the rest of the day is going to be spent on the physical chemical environment, all right? We're going to talk about that because that's an important element to the distribution and abundance of species. Then on June 16th, we're going to move to another level of organization, which I call the ecology of individuals, all right? So all species and all populations are made up of individual animals, and these individual animals are where they are to a large degree because of their physiology, the way that they interact with the physical environment, and their behavior. So we will talk about physiology and behavior, and this lecture will be about the ecology of individuals. The third lecture will then move to a higher level of organization, and that is the level of organization that we call populations, groups of individuals of a particular species. So we will talk about the biology of populations on the 23rd of June, and then in the last lecture, we're going to the highest level of organization, which is the ecology of communities and ecosystems. This is groups of species and groups of species in combination with the physical chemical environment. So that's all of what ecology really is. Obviously, I can't do everything in this class. For one, you're of varied backgrounds, I'm sure, and for another, there just isn't time. So that's what we're going to do, and I hope we will all learn something and have fun doing it. Okay, so levels of discussion. Here again, this is a little different for me because if I were teaching juniors or senior undergraduate biology majors, I would know what their backgrounds are. I would know what the prerequisites were for them to take the course. So there'll be some fairly complicated stuff. There'll be other things that are much less complicated. I'm going to try to make all of the explanations intuitive, that is simply by logic and words explaining things. I will use to some degree graphical representations, and I will use to some degree in places simple mathematical representations. We simply have to do that, okay? I don't think you need to understand any of the math to get a lot out of listening to the course. You do have to be able to look at and interpret a graph, all right? There will be simple graphs. So those are the levels of sort of complexity at which we will talk about ecology. So now I want to move very quickly into what I call method in ecology. How do ecologists do things? How do they understand or attempt to understand, describe and understand the distribution and abundance of species? There are really 5 ways that in the modern world people either have done this or are doing it. The first is what I call simple observation and description. One goes into nature, one looks and one measures, and one makes inferences based on what one sees and describes. That's observation and description. The second major approach that people use, and observation and description is really about the documentation of pattern. The understanding of process comes at these other levels of method. And one of those methods is what I call manipulative experiments, where we actually go out and perturb nature in some way to see how the distribution and abundance of species changes following that perturbation, thereby making an inference of cause. Those are manipulative experiments. Another major way that ecologists understand process is what's called natural experiments. Natural experiments are large-scale changes in nature, maybe a climate change, maybe something that people have done to the world that provides a disturbance to nature that allows an inference of process. So that's this third way that ecologists work. And we'll come back to these approaches again and again through the course, and you'll see examples of them. The fourth way that ecologists make inferences about process is by way of models. Models are typically either graphical or mathematical. Models are simply characterizations of nature, assumptions of the way nature works, and then creating some artificial structure to see how that behaves, that structure behaves, and thereby drawing inferences about nature from graphs and mathematical relationships. And the fifth way that ecologists in recent years have come to understand nature is what we call syntheses and meta-analyses. We now have immense computing capacity. There's a huge amount of data available in the world. And so a whole generation, really, of ecologists have gone to exploiting those capacities and those data to make inferences about nature. I've written down this word at the end, NCs. It's an acronym for the National Center for Ecological Analysis into Synthesis. NCs was a group that developed by funding from the National Science Foundation through the University of California at Santa Barbara about 25 years ago. And the whole point of NCs was to do this, synthesis and analysis. In fact, if you were a participant in an NCs program, you were prohibited from going into nature and gathering any new data. It was all about stuff that was already there, all right? So these are the 5 ways that ecologists generally make inferences about nature. That's all I'm going to say about method in ecology. Now I'm going to move to a brief history of ecology. And by brief, I mean very brief, all right? This is a topology of sorts of how ecology has happened over the years, when it began, and what the major developments have been through the course of that history. And let me just run through it. It really started with Darwin. Darwin was a naturalist. Darwin was an observer of nature, and Darwin began a lot of modern ecology by way of those observations. The next major development in ecology was what I call the plant ecologists. The plant ecologists came onto the scene in the early part of the 20th century, and they were attempting to understand the distribution and abundance of plants. And that's because plants really are the dominant form of life on Earth that we see. And so plant ecology was the first place that ecologists really looked. Plant ecology then grew into a branch of process called succession. And succession was the study of the way plant communities change following a disturbance. So everyone recognized that nature was constantly being disturbed. There were fires. There were all kinds of things that were happening. Organisms die. There's a freeze of some sort or whatever. Nature is constantly being disturbed, and those disturbances are followed by recoveries. And those patterns of recovery are what are called succession. So there's a huge amount of the field of ecology that focuses on succession. Next comes the role of animals. Up until the 1930s, animals were thought to have virtually no important role in nature. It was all about plants, and plants were affected by the physical environment, but not about animals. So Charles Elton, who is a British ecologist, came along, and he really was the person that introduced the idea that animals can matter to the distribution and abundance of species, including plants. Oops, sorry. There we go. Next is what I call the ecosystem concept. The ecosystem concept came into the fore as a result of Sir Arthur Tansley, a famous British ecologist. Elton also was a British ecologist. Elton was at Oxford. Tansley, I think, was at Cambridge. And Tansley recognized that there was that ecosystem concept, which is the concept of both the living world and the abiotic world. And that, in his mind, was what he called an ecosystem, all right? The physical world and the biological world in nature. The ecosystem concept then led to ecosystem ecology. And ecosystem ecology is something that developed probably in the 1940s, and it really has mostly to do with the dynamics of ecosystems and the process of material and energy flow through nature. And by material, I mean compounds, carbon-based molecules, things of that sort are material, and energy is energy. And so ecosystem ecology is about the flux of materials and energy through nature. The next major development really was population biology and population regulation. And we'll talk some about this, and we'll talk about these people when we get into this in a couple of sessions. Probably the two most important people in population biology are Lotka and Volterra. Lotka and Volterra were both mathematicians, and they developed what are called the Lotka-Volterra equations, which are still fundamentally important in thinking about how the numbers of animals or plants change through time and in space in nature. So this was another really major development. David Lack, who is a British ecologist, was also important in population regulation. The next major development was the study of the diversity of species. It was recognized by this time that there were millions of species around the world, and what was responsible for how many species there were and where the patterns of diversity of species. And the major contributor to this was Evelyn Hutchinson. Hutchinson was at Yale University, and he began the study of species diversity. The next major development in the history of ecology was the study of competition. There was a period of probably 20 or 30 years in the history of ecology where competition was thought to be the main cause of the distribution and abundance of species. And probably the most important or influential person in that period of study was a man by the name of Robert MacArthur, who was at Princeton, all right? The view that competition was really the driving process of the distribution and abundance of species had a major transition in the early 1960s with what is called the Green World Hypothesis. And I will get into that at the end. The Green World Hypothesis was a very brief paper that was published by Nelson Harston and colleagues who were at the University of Michigan. And they simply proposed that the reason that the world is green is not so much exclusively because of rain and temperature and nutrients, but it is because of predators limiting herbivores. And if it weren't for predators limiting herbivores, that herbivores would eat all the plants and we wouldn't have a green world. And so their hypothesis was that the world is green because of this interaction of species from predators to herbivores to plants. So we'll get into that as we get down the line here a bit. The next kind of major conceptual development in ecology has to do with stability, or the stability of ecological systems. I'm not going to talk much about this. It's fairly complicated, both theoretically and empirically, but it has been a very important part of the development of ecology, and probably the most important early thinker in this area, in my opinion anyway, was Dick Lewontin. Dick Lewontin was actually a population geneticist. Dick Lewontin was one of the discoverers of gel electrophoresis, in fact, but he was also a very good thinker at higher levels of organization. And he introduced ecology to some ideas that were pretty important down the line about the nature of stability of ecological systems. The next significant development, in my view, was the work on food web dynamics that entered the field. And one of the more important people in this arena was Bob Paine. Bob Paine was at the University of Washington. He also was my mentor. And I'll talk a little bit about some of Payne's work later. And then really the last element of the development of the history of ecology is application of ecology to human problems and human needs. And most of this application has to do with management, timber management, fisheries management, using ecological principles to allow nature to serve people and to sustain nature. That's what management is all about. And conservation, which came in later. And conservation was essentially the dimension to ecology that was intended to try to keep people from destroying nature. So that's it. That's kind of a brief history of ecology. And some of this may not mean too much to you, but it should at least give you kind of a general sense of when ecology started and what some of the big developments have been along the way. All right, I'm going to move now into the major part of today's class, which is the abiotic environment, the physical environment, all right? The abiotic environment or the physical environment, our considerations there in ecology are mostly about energy or heat, water, and various chemicals, carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, oxygen, and a whole variety of other things. So the physical or abiotic environment is really about energy, water, and chemicals. So now we have to go into physics, because physics is what dictates a lot of the physical environment. And there are two very important laws or relationships of physics that are fundamental to ecology. The first is the ideal gas law. The ideal gas law is really simple. It just says, it's actually complex in detail, but simple in concept. There are three variables in the ideal gas law: pressure, volume, and temperature. And all the ideal gas law says is that pressure times volume equals some constant times temperature. So if temperature goes up and everything else is, and pressure is held constant, then volume must go up. If temperature goes up and volume is constant, then pressure must go up. And this NR is just a constant. It's just a constant that is dictated by the particular gas that's being looked at. We're mostly interested in our atmosphere, all right? That's the gas that we're interested in ecology. But the ideal gas law is very important, and it will be fundamental to our understanding of some things I'm going to talk about in a moment. The second really important law of physics is the relationship between temperature and the moisture content of the atmosphere. And that's simply shown by this line here. So what you see is temperature along the x-axis here, and the capacity of the atmosphere to hold water on the y-axis, the vertical axis here. And as you can see, as temperature gets higher and higher and higher, the capacity of the atmosphere to hold moisture goes up very rapidly. So in cold environments, they are necessarily always going to be dry. Warmer environments can become much, much more moist, all right? Okay, that's physics. Now, temperature and why temperature matters. The reason temperature matters for the most part is because it dictates the rate at which biology works. It dictates the reaction rates of organisms and their function. And I've just shown that here in two graphs, okay? This is, on the lower left, is a graph that shows the rate of a digestive reaction as a function of temperature. And as you can see, as temperature goes up, the rate of that reaction goes up to a point, and then it falls off very quickly. The reason it falls off very quickly is because at this point, temperature becomes destructive to the organic molecules, to the enzymes that catalyze this reaction. So as it gets warmer and warmer and warmer, the reaction rates go up, organisms can operate more quickly. This is for an animal. This is exactly the same sort of plot for the rate of photosynthesis of a particular plant, the rate at which a plant can absorb carbon dioxide, from the atmosphere and make carbohydrate. All right, that's photosynthesis. And as you can see here again, for this particular plant species, as it gets warmer and warmer, its potential rate of photosynthesis goes up, up, up to a point and then falls off very quickly for the same exact reason. It becomes too hot and the plant dies. And it dies in this case because the enzymes that are catalyzing photosynthesis are destroyed. So that's why temperature matters, and it matters a lot what the temperature of both the environment is and your internal body temperature as to how effectively and efficiently you are able to operate as an individual organism. Okay, now I need to move to heat transfer because heat is what temperature is all about. Temperature and heat are related. Temperature is simply a measure of the amount of heat energy that there is in the environment. And heat changes and moves around in the world. And it moves around in the world for two reasons. One is because of chemical state changes, and the other is through three processes of physics: conduction, convection, and radiation. Conduction is simply the flow of heat from one body that's in contact with another body. Convection is the flow of heat through mass movement. So the flow of heat through a wind, for example, is convection. And radiation is the flow of heat through radiant energy. So for example, from the sun to the earth, heat gets from the sun to the earth through radiation. So these are the three ways in physics that heat moves. And now we're going to just move and talk a little bit about chemical state changes and heat. And almost every material, and in particular water, which is what we're interested in, has three physical states: a solid state, ice; the liquid state, water; and a gaseous state, steam or whatever, all right? And as water transitions from solid to liquid, or liquid to gas, or from gas to liquid, or liquid to solid, it either absorbs or releases large amounts of heat. And that's very important to the physical world, all right? So this is the way heat moves in nature. Solar radiation. You all know that solar radiation is where all of our energy comes from. Our heat energy, virtually all of the energy on Earth comes from solar radiation. Solar radiation is the major driver of climate on Earth. So now we're going to talk a little bit about that, all right? This is simply a figure that you can look at that tells you a little bit about the pathways of radiation, all right? So solar radiation comes in from the sun. Some of it is reflected by the clouds. Some of it is reflected by the surface of the earth. Some of it is absorbed by the greenhouse gases. Some of the solar radiation that actually warms the earth is re-radiated. Some of that is reflected back. Some of it makes it through the greenhouse gases and goes back out into the universe or into our solar system, and so on and so forth. This is just nothing more than just kind of a flow diagram to show you what happens to solar radiation as it comes in from the sun, all right? Now what I want to talk about is climate. And climate is nothing more than, as I said, solar radiation is the major driver of climate, and climate is the global pattern of temperature and precipitation. So we're going to talk about that now. And this one is the global pattern of temperature, all right? No surprises. It's hot at the equator and it's cold at the poles, all right? No surprises there. This is a heat map that simply shows the average annual temperature of the atmosphere around the world, all right? This is another sort of a heat map that shows the annual precipitation around the world. And the thing that I want you to notice from this is that it does not mirror the pattern of temperature. Pattern of temperature is exactly as you would expect it to be, because the sun is shining directly at the earth, at the equator, and hits at a greater and greater angle as you get closer to the poles, and because it's hitting at a greater angle, there's a lower concentration of radiant energy that's reaching the Earth, and more of that radiant energy is being absorbed by the atmosphere. And that's why it gets colder and colder and colder as you get from the equator to the poles. Whereas the patterns of precipitation, the dark here are the wetter places, the light are the drier places, really different. You can see that it's really wet right across the tropics, that it can be very dry at mid-latitudes, as you see here in Argentina and Chile and in southern Australia and in South Africa, or above the equator across the Sahara, the Gobi Desert, and parts of North America. Those are where the deserts are. That's where it's very dry. And then above that, toward the pole, it gets wet again. So how is it that temperature and precipitation are so different from one another? Okay, I'm going to explain why that is now. All right, what causes climate to vary? As I said, solar radiation is the major driver of climate, okay? And this map, again, is a heat map that simply shows the patterns of solar radiation, the intensity of solar radiation across the globe. Warmer colors are more solar radiation, cooler colors are less solar radiation. Why does that matter? Because of one of the laws of physics. So as solar radiation reaches the equator at its highest intensity, it's going to warm the surface of the Earth, and that warming of the surface of the Earth is going to warm the air. And because of the ideal gas law, that warming air is going to expand. And as it expands, it's going to become less dense. And because it becomes less dense, it is going to rise, all right? So it warms and rises. And as it warms, its capacity to hold moisture increases because of that relationship between temperature and the capacity of the atmosphere to hold moisture. So what happens is that it gets very warm right on the equator. The air starts to warm and rise and become more and more moist because it can absorb more and more water. And it continues to do this, all right? So we have warm air rising, and then beyond, on the outskirts of this large body of warm air rising, we have cool air sinking, because where material moves in one direction, there has to be some sort of a compensation in the other direction, okay? So as the warm air rises, it eventually becomes so moist and so cool again by expanding, that the air that is, or the moisture that's in that air goes from a gaseous state to a liquid state. And that is what creates clouds, and that is what creates rain. So this happens in a really interesting way around the world. So the solar radiation is most intense right at the equator. This causes what we call uplift, the rising of gas, the formation of clouds, and that keeps going up, up, up through what we call the troposphere, that is the lower 30,000 or so feet of our atmosphere, to the stratosphere. And when this rising air hits the stratosphere, all of a sudden, the stratosphere becomes very much warmer. And because of that, the air can no longer rise, all right? It can no longer rise because the atmosphere, the overlying atmosphere is hot. And so it hits a stone wall. That rising air hits a stone wall, it's got to go somewhere, and it is pushed toward the poles. It's pushed toward the North Pole, and it's pushed toward the South Pole. And as it moves closer and closer to the North Pole, because the solar radiation is less and less, it starts to cool. And when it reaches a particular point, it falls, all right? So that warm air that rose up at the equator gets pushed toward the pole, gets cold, sinks back, all right, sinks right back to the surface, and then gets squeezed again back toward the equator. And this circulation of gas, of air, is called a Hadley cell. It's a Hadley cell, all right? And it happens from the equator toward the North Pole, and it happens exactly the same way, equator toward the South Pole. If we go to the top of the Earth, exactly the opposite thing happens. This is the coldest place on Earth, all right? South Pole is the same thing, the coldest place on Earth. So instead of the air rising at the pole, it sinks at the poles, all right? And when it hits the surface of the Earth, it is pushed toward the equator in the North Pole and in the South Pole. And as it is pushed toward the equator, it gradually reaches warmer and warmer Earth's surface temperature, and it goes up, all right? It goes up, and so we have a cell of circulating air that falls at the pole, goes along the Earth's surface, goes up, and creates a circulation pattern like this, and that's called a polar cell. And as a consequence of the Hadley cell at the equator and the polar cell at the pole, there is an in-between cell called the Ferrel cell that is just being driven by these extreme cells, the Hadley cell at the equator and the polar cell at the pole. So we have these three cells of atmospheric circulation rising up at the equator, sinking at about 30 degrees latitude, rising up again at about 45, 50 degrees latitude, and sinking again at 90 degrees at the pole. All right, so we have these three cells that rotate in that way, and it's all driven by solar radiation. All right. The surface pressure at the equator is always low, and that's because the air is constantly being pushed upward. It's rising and expanding, and so the equator is always low pressure. Mid-latitudes are always high pressure. Higher mid-latitudes are always low pressure, and the poles are always high pressure environments, all right? As a result of that, this uplift that occurs right at the equator is where all the rain falls. As you go up to about 25 or 30 degrees north or south latitude, we have the air falling down toward the surface of the Earth. That becomes a high pressure area of the Earth, all right? It becomes very dry because the air is sinking, it's not rising, all right? It is warming, it is not cooling as it goes up. And at the pole, we have the same sort of an event where the air is sinking, and because it's sinking, it's very dry, all right? Whereas at about 45 degrees north or south latitude, we have air rising again, and that rising air is able to create a lot of precipitation because it is relatively warm air that is cooling as it goes up, just as it does on the equator. And so that explains this anomaly of the difference between temperature, global temperature, and global precipitation. Global temperature varies constantly from hot at the equator to cold at the poles, no surprise there, but precipitation varies in a very different way. High at the equator, dry at low mid-latitudes, wet at high mid-latitudes, and dry at the poles. That explains the patterns of moisture and deserts around the world. So we have pressure that is low at the equator, high at the poles, and high in between. And this pressure gradient creates wind. Because you have a surface pressure gradient, the gas is going to move from areas of high pressure to areas of low pressure, and that's what generates our wind. There are two major gradients of wind generation. There are latitudinal gradients that are caused by the development by these Hadley, Ferrel, and polar cells, and there is sea to land gradients. So I'll talk just a little bit about that. But all of our winds around the surface of the Earth are generated by these pressure gradients, all right? So in the Northern Hemisphere, let's see, let me just go here and say that in the Northern Hemisphere, we have low pressure at the equator, high pressure at around 30 degrees, low pressure again at around 60 degrees, high pressure again at around, at the poles, all right? That means that the air is going to flow from the poles to around 60 degrees. It is going to flow from the high pressure cell at around 30 degrees toward 60 degrees and toward the equator, because those are both low pressure areas, all right? And the same thing in the Southern Hemisphere, all right? It's going to happen exactly the same way, except that in the direction of flow is altered by what we call the Coriolis effect. And the Coriolis effect is nothing more than a phenomenon that is related to the different velocity of movement of the surface of the Earth from the equator to the pole, all right? So the Coriolis effect is generated by that differing velocity. So right at the top of the Earth, it's not moving at all. Right at the equator, it's moving at its maximum velocity. And all of the materials, the atmosphere and the ocean, the things that can move around in the world, have inertia, all right? They have friction and they have inertia. And so imagine that you had a globe and you were spinning that globe. You're spinning the globe around and you take a marble and you roll it from the North Pole down the face of the globe. Is it going to go straight at a constant longitude? No, it's not. It's going to basically bend, and it's going to bend because it has mass, it has inertia, and the velocity of the Earth is dragging it in a particular direction, all right? So that direction of deflection as a result of inertia and varying velocity of the surface of the Earth is called the Coriolis effect. And it always makes things spin in a clockwise direction in the Northern Hemisphere and a counterclockwise direction in the Southern Hemisphere. It always happens that way. So this causes the flow of air that goes from the poles to mid-latitude, high latitudes, from and from the high pressure zones to the low pressure zones to bend, all right? And they're going to bend in a clockwise direction in the Northern Hemisphere and a counterclockwise direction in the Southern Hemisphere. And that bending of the winds is what creates what we call the westerlies at high latitudes, and the trade winds, the northeast trade winds at low latitudes in the Northern Hemisphere, and the southeast trade winds, which are at low latitudes in the Southern Hemisphere. So the winds around the world are all driven by these pressure gradients and the Coriolis effect. And the winds drive ocean currents, which are very important to us. So I'm not going to say anything more about it. All right. Now I want to talk a little bit about precipitation, because we've been talking about wind and so on and so forth. And I want to talk about precipitation. And we've already explained why it's wet at the equator and dry at the poles and wet at mid-latitudes, high latitudes, and dry at mid-low latitudes. All right, we've already talked about that because of the Hadley cells, the Ferrel cells, the polar cells, and the physics of moisture in the atmosphere. All right, so that's what causes the global patterns of precipitation to be as they are. All right, and that's what results in this general heat map of precipitation that we see if we look at the Earth, where it is wet across the tropics, it is wet across mid-high latitudes, and it's dry across the mid-low latitudes. So that gives you, if someone, now you should understand why it is that it's dry in Santa Cruz, it's wet in Seattle, and it's wet in Panama, and it's dry in Barrow, Alaska. You know, it doesn't follow temperature directly, but temperature is the primary driver of all of that, all right? And you should also understand now, to some degree, why it's windy here. It's windy here because we're in an area where the pressure gradient, the global pressure gradient, creates a wind that flows southward, and that is exacerbated by the fact that at this time of the year, right now in the summer, solar radiation is the highest. It's causing the land to become hotter. That hotter land creates a greater pressure gradient between the land and the sea than occurs during the winter. And so the winds blow like Hades here in the summertime. It's windy in Santa Cruz because of that. And it's starting to blow right here now as I'm looking out my window, as happens every day. Temperature variation. Temperature varies on a number of scales, all right? It's not constant through time. It varies on a daily scale that has to do with the Earth's rotation. It varies on a seasonal scale, which has to do with the rotation, the orbit of the Earth around the sun. It varies on decadal scales, 10 to 20 to 30 years, and it varies on very long time scales of thousands of years. So I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these, all right? So the daily variation in temperature is pretty obvious. During the daytime, when the sun is shining, it gets warmer. During the nighttime, when the sun is behind the Earth, it gets cooler. And we see this typical pattern of warm during the day, cool during the evening, warm during the day, cool during the evening. But it's not the same. The daily temperature variation is not the same everywhere. So this heat map that I'm showing you here at the bottom is a heat map of the range of daily temperature variation on average across the United States. And what you can see is that in the West, there's much more daily temperature variation than there is in the East. And that's because daily temperature variation decreases with cloud cover. It's a lot wetter in the East than it is in the West. It varies with vegetation, in large part because vegetation absorbs heat and produces water. And it varies with increased humidity. And it increases with elevation and with the distance from large bodies of water. So as we get further and further from the ocean, the daily temperature variation gets greater and greater, all right? As we go to the tops of mountains, if you go over to the top of the Sierras, the daily temperature variation is going to be a lot more than it is down at Bishop or over in somewhere in the foothills of the Sierras. Daily temperature variation, and this becomes important to organisms because they have to contend with this, all right? Seasonal temperature variation. This also is vastly variable across the surface of the Earth. The seasonal variation is simply the mean minimum minus the mean maximum, or the mean maximum minus the mean minimum, all right? So in Santa Cruz, our seasonal variation is 7.8 degrees centigrade. That is the average temperature between January and August the difference is 7.8 degrees. If we go right to the tropics, it's virtually zero. There is no seasonal temperature variation. The greatest seasonal temperature variation in the world is in Siberia. Almost 60 degrees. Can be average temperature, very hot in the summer and bitterly cold in the wintertime. And this seasonal temperature variation has a lot to do with distance from oceans and the size of the land mass. All right, so seasonal temperature variation increases with distance from large water bodies. It tends to increase with latitude. So in parts of Asia, it's tremendously high, all right? So this is just a kind of an interesting little tidbit that the seasonal temperature variation is greater in Siberia than the average difference in temperature between Antarctica and the Sahara Desert. Decadal temperature variation, all right? And we're going to talk a little bit about decadal temperature variation because this is another source of variation that you're all probably somewhat familiar with. You've heard about El Nino events. You may have heard about the North Atlantic Oscillation, which is a temperature anomaly, an oscillation that occurs at about a 20 to 30 year time scale. Or in the Pacific, what we call the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, which is similarly another temperature variation, a period of warm versus cold that occurs at about 20 to 30 year timescales. These patterns of temperature variation, the El Nino Southern Oscillation temperature variation that occurs throughout the world, the North Atlantic Oscillation that occurs mostly in the Atlantic Basin, and the Pacific Decadal Oscillation that occurs on this side of the world, the causes are still largely unknown. We don't really know why these things behave as they do. Whereas we completely understand daily temperature variation, and we completely understand annual temperature variation. The next major level of temperature variation is called occurs at much longer time scales. This is thousands of years, all right? So global temperatures have shown major oscillations over the history of life on Earth from anywhere from 40,000 to 100,000 year periods, all right? So this figure, and this is a result or is caused by something that is called the Milankovitch cycle. The Milankovitch cycle. And the Milankovitch cycle is driven by variation in the tilt of the Earth relative to the sun and the orbit of the Earth around the sun, the degree to which that orbit is circular on the one hand versus elliptical on the other. And those both change. And that's what causes this temperature variation. So this is a temperature graph that shows the temperature anomaly from the long-term 5 million year average through time. And as you can see, if we go back about 5 million years, it's somewhat warmer then than it was on average over the last 5 million years. And the temperatures were fluctuating, and they were fluctuating at about a 40,000 year period, all right? And that continued on for about 2 million years until the Miocene-Pliocene border. At about the Miocene-Pliocene border, all of a sudden, the cycle started becoming more pronounced, and the overall Earth temperature started to cool. And this cooling is called a glacial age. There have been 5 glacial ages in the history of the Earth, and we are currently in the last of those, all right? The most recent of those, I should say. There'll be more, but we're in the most recent of those. In this current glacial age, which started about 2.5 million years ago, the cycles became much more pronounced. It became warmer during the high part of the cycle and colder during the low part of the cycle. And the cycles then became much longer in duration, from about 40,000 years to about 100,000 years. And it's these 100,000 year large cycles that are responsible for the waxing and the waning of the glaciers during what we call the Pleistocene. So during the high points, it was warm and relatively ice-free, and during the low points, it was cold and very icy. And we are now in a cold phase, all right? We are actually in a cold phase, despite the fact that we have global warming. So this is just the pattern of temperature change that has occurred over the last 5 million years, and to show you how interesting and dynamic it is, right? The reason for these large-scale changes, as I said, is the Milankovitch cycle. And the Milankovitch cycle is driven by 2 things. One is the axis of the Earth relative to the sun. So if the Earth were spinning along an axis that was perfectly perpendicular to the sun, this angle would be 0 degrees, but it doesn't. It's bent over to some degree. And that degree to which it's bent over varies from about 22 degrees from the vertical to about 24 and a half, 25 degrees from the vertical. So depending upon how much it bends over, that's going to cause seasons to become quite different, all right? In addition to that, and I don't know why this is, I'm sure somebody does, the way in which the Earth trajectories around the sun varies from more circular to more elliptical. So when it's more elliptical, it's closer to the sun during its close periods and further from the sun during its far periods. And when it's more circular, it's closer, it's more evenly distributed, the distance of the Earth to the sun. And so both this bending and the ellipticality are what drive these Milankovitch cycles, all right, because they have a major impact on temperature. Okay, let me see where we are. What time is it? It is 12 o'clock. So why don't we take a break, and I will go back. Let's take a 10-minute break. I'm good to sit here, and we can talk a little bit if we want to, and then we'll pick up again immediately at 12:10, and we'll go till about 12:45, and then we'll talk, okay? So why don't you unmute your microphones, and let me see what I can figure out here.
Unmute. I don't think so.
Yeah, so now I can see everybody, and we can, and then let's see if we have any questions. Barry, were you going to maybe just, well, I see none, so we have no hands up. So let's see.
Right. If people want to say something, you can just unmute yourself and ask a question.
Yeah, if you want to, or if you want to wait till the end, we can do that as well. However you want to do it. I'm just going to sit here and enjoy my coffee for a short while.
It's wonderful that we don't have tests. Thank you.
I would be interested in just, for all of you that are on here, I know one person or two. I know Barry and Rusty. Well, and I also know Lois, but I don't think I know any of the rest of you. And so I would just be interested in knowing a little bit about your backgrounds and interests. And, you know, as I was saying, one of the biggest points of uncertainty for me in doing a class like this is like, who am I talking to? You know, how much, what are you artists? Are you scientists? I mean, you're going to be all kinds of things, but I would just be interested in knowing a little bit about that.
Most of us have a varied background, but we're all interested in whatever educated people have to say.
Well,
not always interested in what educated people have to say.
I think the interesting thing is that when we were in college or university, ecology didn't exist as a subject.
Right, right.
And so although we had diverse interests, whether we were sailors or whether we were gardeners or bird watchers, we didn't really learn about the environment at all. This is all something we've learned after our formal education.
well, you know, when I was an undergraduate, ecology was not a serious class. They actually offered an ecology class, and that was the last course that I took as an undergraduate student. Let's see, I'm trying to figure out. Oh, there we go. Let's see. How do I get out of this thing here? That participant
Up at the top. Up here.
raise hand, mute.
Where it says you are viewing Estes screen, and you can change it up there on the top.
Just this view options. Fit the window original size.
So I'm trying to figure out here. Let's see how to get rid of this thing.
No.
On my computer, it's at the very top. There's a green ribbon that reads, "You are
Yeah.
viewing."
Oh, I see it. I see
Okay.
it.
Right, that's the
Oh, I
place.
thought I saw it. No, it didn't work.
You got to put your arrow up on the top of your screen.
Okay.
And then it says you are viewing the screen, and you've got to just click it.
Just click view options and it'll give you choices.
The reason I'm down here looking up underneath is I've got a camera that I can't. So well, that's gone now, or it's over on the right.
Now you're huge. Yeah.
Okay, there you are.
There you are, full screen.
That's not what
There we are, if we want to be.
You are
I
full
wanted
screen.
to do.
Never want to be full screen.
Everybody has their viewing options you can set.
Yeah, we can see
So you
everything.
can see the whole group, you can see the presenter or whatever.
Yeah.
So this thing, though, that
Down there.
participants, we have 27 people, and I'm trying to get rid of you all. Close. There.
You get rid of
That's
us?
minimum.
Yeah, no, I got. So now I need to go to my screen option again, right? Or no, I go to this and oops.
Right. Many of these people are very shy, and they're not showing their faces.
Well, let's see here. Okay, now what am I?
There we are.
So I'm back on this, but now I can't. Oh, wait a minute.
What is it you want to do?
I want to get my picture back up on here. Let's see. That's what.
Barry, you're muted.
Go up to speaker view on the right.
Jim, are you trying to get back into the share screen mode?
Yeah.
So, I mean, put your cursor up so that you see all your choices down at the bottom of your Zoom choices. If you move your cursor,
I am, and nothing is happening.
so you don't, okay, so
Oh, there it is.
okay.
Oops, there it is. So share screen. I want to go to that. There we go.
Yep,
Did it.
yep.
You're going to have to bear with me, folks.
Oh,
This is the,
Most of us are in the same boat.
yeah, new technology.
this group is much more tolerant than a group of undergraduates.
Okay. How are we doing for time here? Take a couple more minutes for people to join.
So Jim, at this last slide where you're seeing the big swings,
Mhm.
what period of time? Oh, you said those are like 100,000 year periods.
So the period of transition from the period of transition from say the circular to the more elliptical, that varies from 40 to 100,000 years. The combined transition between the path of ellipticality and the angle of the axis together are what cause the overall degree to which the average temperature is either high or low. I don't know. I'm sure somebody knows. I don't what the period of variation of ellipticality is, and also the period of variation in the angle of axis.
Right.
I don't know what those periods are, but together they're very slow. They happen very, very slowly, and together, like I say, they result in this cyclicity that, for some reason, had a periodicity of about 40,000 years for quite a long time, and then jumped very quickly to about 100,000 years.
So where are we now?
We're in the 100,000 year cycle.
So we're in the biggest elliptical.
We are in the biggest elliptical, right? The more ellipse trajectory. We are in what is called a glacial age. So the Pleistocene, the last 1,000,000+ years, have been a period of Earth history where temperatures have been varying on about 100,000-year cycle. And those 100,000-year cycles have resulted in the ice ages and the interglacials. So we are in a cool period now, not a full-on ice age, but toward the end of an ice age. And of course, we're also in a period of anthropogenic global warming, which has changed all of that fairly quickly. I'm going to talk about that next.
Mm-hmm. I guess part of what causes this is the movement of the other planets, and they have a gravitational force on the Earth, and that will make us elliptical or circular.
It probably has a lot to do with that, and perhaps even other things. It may have something to do with the relationship of our planet to the moon, and the way that influences the trajectory of the Earth around the sun. These are outside my realm of knowledge. I don't know what causes those things.
Right.
Mark will know and can answer it when he comes back, but he's on another Zoom call for his work.
Sort of figuring that a lot of this stuff, there'll probably be people that are maybe watching in that know these things, know about these things. But I think the main thing that I wanted to get across today was sort of and I don't know whether this is all repeat for you people, if you know all this stuff, or if it's new information. So that's something I need to know. If it's new information, then we're probably about on right track. If it's new information that's absorbable and understandable, then we're definitely on the right track. If it's new information that's incomprehensible, then it's not doing anybody any good. And if it's not new information, it's not doing anybody any good. So yeah, a little bit of feedback there would be good. And I can adjust the upcoming lectures accordingly. I think some of them are going to be, I'm not going to hold back from talking about some of the technical details, but I'm going to try not to be, lose you in that either. Most of this stuff is relatively straightforward, I think, although when I learned it, it was surprising. And I actually didn't learn this stuff. This was not part of ecology when I took ecology, so I didn't learn it until I started teaching ecology. I remember people asking about this during qualifying exams, and I didn't know the answer. And I was thinking, well, I'm glad I'm not that student, because I'd miss that part.
No, Jim, let me assure you, this is new information. Okay, it's being explained very well, but there is a lot of it. So it's challenging. And this is Rusty, who presumably, I've never had an ecology course, I must say. Okay, so this is quite enlightening.
This is, I know that there's a fair amount of information, and this was always the criticism when I was teaching ecology. I would say, you're covering too much, and I'm just saying, this is who I am, and just the way I'm doing it. And, I wonder if it would be possible to record these things. And
Jim, it is being done as we speak.
Oh, okay, great.
In fact, the Zoom makes a really nice, high-quality recording, and so at the end, I'll send this to you.
Okay, that's fabulous, because then if you want to go back and look at something and say, I didn't quite get that, and look at it, and if it's not clear because I screwed it up, you can write to me, or we can sort out the problems. All right.
It's also possible to do a print screen. Every time you put up a new slide, I just hit the print screen on my computer so I can go back and look at these pictures, and hopefully I'll remember what you've said.
Great. Well, but you also have the narrative too, because it's being recorded. So
yes.
Where's that option of print
You would
screen?
know the answer to these things.
Yeah, I don't know where.
Well, if you're
Melania.
if you're on a Mac laptop,
Yeah.
you hit Command, Shift, and 3 all simultaneously, and it'll print whatever's on your screen.
Oh.
Perfect.
It'll
Command.
just appear on it.
Okay.
Yeah, hear it? You
Yeah,
hear the click?
yeah.
Right.
And it'll be somewhere on your laptop, and it'll just say screenshot. So you have to figure out later, you
Oh,
know,
you can do that with a
where
phone as well.
order or anything like that.
Okay. And the recording, how do you get back to that?
Well, that's something we can talk to Jim about, but for some of the classes, we've put them on the OLI website.
Okay. Okay.
Good.
I'd be happy for you to do that if you want to do it.
Mark is back. Did somebody have a question about the cycles?
Oh, your voice went out, Jenna. I don't know why.
Oh, sorry. I said Mark is back now. So did someone have questions about the Milankovitch cycles? I forget what the question was.
I think the question was, do we know why the orbits vary from more elliptical to more circular? What is it that causes that?
I think it's the influence of the larger planets, like Jupiter, probably mostly Jupiter. We get a sort of a pulsing push-pull as Jupiter is closer and farther away.
Wow.
And it's orbiting much slower, so I think it cycles our orbit through different levels of eccentricity.
So that makes great sense. Barry, I think that was your intuitive view. The other question was, do we know why the axis of orbit varies? It's a wobble, sort of. I mean, it's described a lot of times as a wobble. But is it like when a top runs down and it starts to wobble? I mean, what is it that causes that, or is that even known?
I think that has something to do with the fact that the moon is, we're tilted about 20 some degrees from the ecliptic plane, the plane that we orbit in around the sun, and the moon is close to that.
Oh, we lost.
And the tide exerts a torsion on an axis perpendicular to the spin of the Earth, and so that causes a precession.
I see.
In a similar way to a top's behavior. That's because the Earth is oblate and the equator is fatter than the poles. You have a little bit of a torque that's just trying to pull that the axis back toward the perpendicular to the elliptic plane, and of course the response of a top is sort of it moves perpendicular to that force, the torque, the laws of angular momentum. So I think it's driven by the tidal forces exerted on the Earth by the moon.
Well, I learned something.
It might even be true.
Shall we move on?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
I think I don't have a lot more material today, but I do have some, and then I wanted to leave some time at the end to talk. And I think this has given me a little sense. This is the first time I've ever given a lecture on Zoom. So it's kind of given me a sense of pace as well. And I can probably adjust things a little bit more for next time, given that. Okay, so let me get rid of this.
2 hours.
I want to move to the last dimension to the discussion of temperature change, and that has to do with global warming. And obviously, this is something that you all are familiar with. It's been in the news. It's in the popular literature. It's something we think about and are talking about all the time in terms of the future of this planet. These are some early graphs. And there are really two, I think there's 2 or 3 interesting elements of global change or global warming. One of them has to do with the degree to which it's anthropogenic. It's been somewhat controversial. I don't think scientifically controversial at all, really, but there's always some, and so there's some controversy there. There is the issue of the exact imagined trajectory, what's going to happen, and how the world's going to change, and that's a big issue. Most of what we know about, that's common knowledge anyway, about global change is information that has come by way of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is an entity that was created through the United Nations. It's oftentimes referred to by the acronym or the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And essentially it is simply an effort to bring the best science and the best analysis to our understanding of global climate change. There have been a number of IPCC reports, and these people are working constantly now on further analyses. But this is a really interesting series of plots that are just data from one of the early IPCC reports. And the upper panel, panel A, simply shows the global average surface temperature through time. From 1850 to the early 2000s is when this time series ended. So these are the data from which people originally began to infer that there was an increase in temperature, global increase in temperature over the last, in this case, about 150 years. This next panel, panel B, is a synopsis of the data on global average sea level change. And as you can see, the average sea level has gone up, 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 up over the same period of time. And the bottom panel is the similar data that actually don't go as far back in time because they don't have the information. They go back to the mid part of the early 20th century. And this simply shows the Northern Hemisphere snow cover through time. And so over on the right, I have provided a synopsis of the data, the figures from this particular analysis. So the temperature increase has been on the order of about 0.74 degrees centigrade per 100 years. That's what we see here. The sea level increase has been on the order of about 18 centimeters per 100 years. All right, it's quite a bit. And the snow cover decrease has been on the order of about 2.7% per 10 years. All right. And all of these trends from a rigorous statistical perspective are accelerating. That is, this is becoming more rapid, this is becoming more rapid, and the temperature is growing more rapidly. So these are the points of concern and some of the data that led to the early recognition and the early argument of global warming. All right. Now, the big question has been, what is the cause? And there's been some argument about this, quite a bit of argument and technical argument over the details. But the fundamental question is, to what degree is this change in temperature that we see and the change in sea level, associated change in sea level, and the associated change in snow cover, to what degree is this a result of naturally occurring phenomena? After all, we have seen through history that climate has changed a lot. And so it's reasonable to imagine that these changes that we are seeing now, and it was reasonable to imagine that these changes that we are seeing now are parts of these natural cycles or changes of temperature and associated changes in ice cover and sea level. All right. So what the scientists in the IPCC have done is what they call a fingerprinting analysis. And that is, they have taken all of what they know about atmospheric science and about the physics of the Earth, independent of the anthropogenic contribution to that. And they have figured out what the patterns of change ought to be given those data. And those are shown in these panels here in the figure in the blue. The blue are sort of the level of uncertainty, but the blue patterns are the expected patterns that would have occurred given everything we know about volcanism and the Milankovitch cycle and all the rest of it, all of the things that we know that drive temperature. And the pink with the fitted, somewhat fitted dark line is the trajectory that has actually occurred, all right? So given that the trajectory that has actually occurred is quite different from the trajectory that would be predicted based on what we know of the physics of the atmosphere, and this was one point of concern, that the climate change was to some significant degree an anthropogenically caused phenomenon, all right? So the climate models based on solar activity, volcanoes, and so on do not match. Those are the blue here. They do not match the observed trends. The climate models that include just one additional factor, and that is the greenhouse gases, the gases that have been produced largely through the consumption and burning of fossil fuels, do match very well, right? Those are the red ones here. And the measured changes are very closely linked with our known emission records. So that's the logic that has led most of the scientific community to conclude that this increased temperature and the associated phenomenon that are going on, global change, are to a large degree anthropogenic in nature. The question is, in addition, what's going to happen? And here there's a lot more uncertainty, and that uncertainty has to do with the future scenarios of emission, right? So the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has produced a series of special reports called the SRES reports. And this has to do, this acronym means the Special Report on Emission Scenarios. So what they have done, given that the emissions now are more pretty much demonstrably responsible for the past changes, they've asked the question, what's going to happen in the future under different emission scenarios? And here are, in the panel on the left, from the IPCC report, or a synopsis of it, at the time that this analysis was actually done, which was in the early 2000s, we have, this was the concentration of carbon dioxide as the primary greenhouse gas. There are others, but carbon dioxide is the main one. And we're starting at that point of about 400 parts per million, all right? So that's, you can see that right here. And then the question is, what's it gonna look like? And there are various scenarios. And those scenarios are shown in these different colored lines. Some of the scenarios are ones that have actual reduction in greenhouse gases because of our behavior and the way that we manage it. Some of them are some of them are like this orange scenario is just a gradual continued increase. Some of them, like the green scenario, is a fairly rapid increase followed by a longer period of decline, as one might expect, let's say, if technology leads us to a way of fueling our energy needs independent of burning fossil fuels. And if it takes, let's say, 20 or 30, 2 or 3 or 4 decades to get to that point. The red scenario is kind of a bad news, worst case, greatly increasing scenario. And the blue one is something that follows a similar trajectory and then finally starts to level off as we just don't have any other choice. So those are the scenarios, some of the scenarios that for the concentrations of greenhouse gas. And then over on the right are plots of what we project the global surface warming to be based on those different scenarios. And so this black line shows the actual data out to a particular point, and then here we are at the time that these scenario analyses were run under different particular scenarios. And so you can see the projection of change in temperature from the mean zero datum at the time that these scenarios were run, which was 0 on this axis. So that was the start point. And you can see from this, the projections of increased average global temperature under these different scenarios. And the worst case scenarios have an increased global temperature of about 3 degrees centigrade. This is constantly being upgraded, and I think now it's thought to be somewhat worse than this. And under the best case scenario, where we would maybe have an increase of about 0.5 degree centigrade from what it was at that particular time. The kind of the Earth systems people have made some efforts to try to understand what this is going to mean to sea level rise and to basically the business of life on Earth. And the 2 degrees increase scenario is a scary scenario. The 3 degrees scenario is a terrifying scenario, at least based on what these folks are telling us we can expect to happen. So this gives you some sense of why there's so much concern. All right, I haven't talked anything about what the actual consequences are of temperature rise, but it isn't just warming, it's sea level rise and all kinds of other things that would become social, agriculture, ports, continental margins, all kinds of things are going to change to some degree based on this. So that's the reason that there's so much concern about it. Okay, I'm going to move from temperature now to the last part of today's talk on the physical environment, which has to do with the notion of a biome. A biome is nothing more than a view of how the biological community, and in particular the plant community on the surface of the Earth, is going to vary as a function of temperature and precipitation. All right. So you all know that it varies a lot. There are places like over here on the mid left that are hot, dry deserts where there's almost nothing. There are places on the equator that are tropical rainforests, and there are all kinds of things in between. And the biome concept was something that was developed probably about 50, 60, 70 years ago in an effort to sort of map basic vegetation types around the globe based on temperature and precipitation. And in part that was done because at that time, ecology really was a science that was built around the notion that physical chemical environment were the major drivers of the distribution and abundance of species. That is really no longer the case, but the biome concept is still a very important one. All right. So for example, here is a map of the so-called tropical rainforest biomes, and the upper left shows the parts of the earth where tropical rainforests occur. There's a picture of one. And the little graph down to the right, the lower right, shows the average temperature in red and the average precipitation in blue of a particular tropical rainforest. This one happens to be in Zaire, all right? So that's where these data came from, all right? So that's a tropical rainforest biome. This, on the other hand, is a desert biome. And so the deserts, as you can see, and we've already talked about why these occur where they are, but the world's major deserts are shown in this panel in the upper left, all right? And they vary somewhat from this photograph in Egypt to over in Arizona in the Sonoran Desert, where there's actually quite a bit of vegetation. But here is a plot again of the average temperature going from low to high in the summer to low. So it varies a lot in contrast to the tropics where it's almost constant. And precipitation, which is virtually zero throughout the year. This happens to be in Algeria in the Sahara Desert. So that's the nature of temperature and precipitation. So the thinking was that if we know average temperature and how it varies through the year, and if we know average precipitation and how that varies through the year, we can create a global map of what the plant communities ought to look like. And of course, that is going to vary probably more continuously than it is in a discrete manner. But to some degree, these are going to form systems that are viewed as known as biomes, like the hot deserts and like the tropical rainforests and like the eastern deciduous forests and so on and so forth. So how many biomes are there? Well, it depends on who creates the characterization, but for the most part, in most of the simple and early analyses of biomes, they were thought to be about 9 biomes. So there's a desert biome, and the tundra biome, and the boreal forest biome, and the temperate deciduous forest biome, and the temperate grassland biome, and the temperate coniferous forest biome, tropical seasonal forest biome, and the tropical rainforest biome. And what this space shows here is called a state space graph, and what it shows is the range of space in 2 dimensions of temperature on the vertical axis and precipitation on the horizontal axis of the range of variation across the surface of the Earth, all right? And it basically is defined by roughly this half of the graph, all right? So where the mean annual precipitation is very high and the mean annual precipitation is also very high, we have tropical rainforests. And where mean annual precipitation is very low and where the mean annual temperature is very low, we have tundra biome and so on and so forth. So that was the intent of this. And here is a map using a somewhat different classification of actual biomes of where these things occur over the course of the Earth, based strictly on physical data or physical chemical data, based strictly on temperature and based strictly on precipitation. And when one uses those temperature and precipitation data that have been gathered around the globe and creates a biome map, this is one of the biome maps that resulted from that effort. There have been a few others. They're going to vary some depending upon the data source and how many biomes you really want to define and so on and so forth. So this is pretty interesting, and this is the way people view the distribution and abundance of overall major land communities until fairly recently. This is actually a figure, again, of the biomes that was created by one of the important players in the recent history of ecology, Robert Whittaker. And what Whittaker recognized was that in this map of biomes, from tundra to tropical rainforests and so on and so forth, there was a great big area that he called ecosystems uncertain. I'm not even sure if that's what it says there, but that's what he called it. That's the black stippled area here. In other words, there's a big area across this range of annual precipitation from about 50 centimeters a year out to about 150 centimeters per year that tends to become narrower as the average temperature gets lower and lower. And this area doesn't work very well. The biome concept simply doesn't work very well. And this is what Whittaker called ecosystems uncertain. If you look at this, sorry, I wanted to go back. How do I go back here? Delete. Why is that? What is it that's causing these ecosystem uncertainty? This is about half of the land surface of the world. So it's not a teeny little part, all right? It's a big chunk of the Earth's surface. The reason that the biome concept doesn't work in many of these areas is because of two other factors. Temperature and precipitation aren't the only things that affect the distribution and abundance of plants. Two other major factors that influence the distribution and abundance of plants, especially at these temperature precipitation combinations, are fire and grazing. Fire and grazing are what create ecosystems uncertain. So a big part of the world's surface is influenced not just by temperature and precipitation, but by burning, wildfire, and by herbivory, by grazers. And we aren't going to talk any more about fire, very little, but we will talk quite a bit about grazing toward the end, all right? So the high points of what we talked about today, I'm almost done. We talked about the two important laws of physics, the universal gas law and the relationship between temperature and the moisture holding capacity of the atmosphere. We talked about heat transfer and heat movement, the ways in which heat moves around between materials and across the surface of the Earth and through the universe or through our solar system. We talked about solar radiation as being the primary source of energy that drives all life on Earth. We talked about how the interaction between solar radiation and the structure of the atmosphere creates these things called Hadley cells, Ferrel cells, and polar cells, which result in latitudinal variation in pressure, which thus results in latitudinal variation in precipitation or the lack of precipitation. We talked about the consequences of pressure variation to the flow of the atmosphere, which is the wind in the atmosphere and the effect of the wind on the surface of the ocean, creating currents. So winds and currents are generated by these pressure gradients that are generated by the Hadley, Ferrel, and polar cells. We talked about the Coriolis effect, which is the bending of winds and currents, the movements of gases and waters on the surface of the Earth as a result of friction, inertia, and variation in angular velocity or absolute velocity of the surface of the Earth. We talked about how precipitation maps onto the Earth and that does not follow exactly from the patterns of solar radiation, but does follow very predictably from our understanding of the creation of Hadley, Ferrel, and polar cells. We talked about the various time variation patterns in temperature from daily to seasonal to decadal to very long Milankovitch cycle variations in temperature. And then at the end, we talked about how this physical environment, and in particular, how precipitation and temperature influence organisms to create what we call biomes and the biome concept. So that's what I have to say about the physical chemical environment. That's the end of this section. We'll have 3 more classes in which I'll talk about next time population biology, individual, the ecology of individuals, and then population biology, and then community and ecosystem ecology. So that's it. And now what I will do is go back to participants, and maybe we can have some discussion if there's any interest in that. How do I do this, Barry?
Go to the very top, and you should have a little green bar there, and you get an option of getting out of screen sharing. But I'll do it.
There we go. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm probably not going to get much better at this either. I'm sorry.
Yeah, okay, but no, people.
I have a question.
So
Which
question, yeah, let's talk.
Which is, where do human beings fit in here, and the population areas? And I noted on the map, which you showed of the world in about 6 or 7 colors, that most of the people live in that dark brown area, which also feels like the area where we're not sure whether it's the heat or the water or what.
Yeah, most of the people live, well, they don't necessarily live at temperate latitudes. There are a fair number of people living in tropical latitudes around the world. Probably the majority of the world populations lives close to the coasts or close to major points of transit at temperate latitudes.
Right, okay.
So, for example, in the United States, the major concentrations of people are around the Great Lakes and the cities around the Great Lakes, because those were significant points of transport, commerce, movement of materials, and the east and west coasts. That's where people tend to be aggregated. So I don't think that the ecosystem's uncertain is affected very much at all about by the impacts of humans, except to the degree that they burn. But burning is something that has always occurred. Humans start a lot of fires, but most of the fires throughout most of the world are probably, at least my understanding is, they're not human caused, that they are naturally caused. Lightning strikes cause a huge number of fires. And that's true in many different parts of the world. There's also very interesting relationship between grazing and fire, which I'll talk about, I think, toward the end. And that is, in places where grazers have been lost, plants have become more abundant. Where plants have become more abundant, fuel loads have increased. And the increases in fuel loads, of course, have caused fires to become hotter and more intense, more extensive and hotter. So there is an interaction between grazing, fuel, and wildfire too. And there's some fascinating examples of that. For example, in Africa, where many of the large animals were lost due to rinderpest. There was a disease in Africa that caused a lot of the large-bodied grazing mammals to be lost from the continent of Africa. When those animals were lost, the plant communities changed. And those changes in plant communities resulted in fuel accumulations, greatly increased fuel accumulations across the savanna grasslands of tropical Africa, and that had a huge effect on wildfire.
I have an observation to make, or at least a question to raise about, the biome concept. Looks like it takes average precipitation and average annual temperature into account. But there's a reversal between, say, here, where the hot season is dry, and tropical Mexico, where the hot season is wet. So that the amount of drying driven by the heat is much different in the dry season, say there as opposed to here, because, well, like all the Mediterranean type climates seem to be hot when they're dry, and cool when they're wet. And what I've observed in going to tropical Mexico is that it's dry in the winter and wet in the summer. You know, you get almost no rain at all in Guadalajara in December, but average of 10 inches in July. And we're just the opposite. So that the likelihood of severe fires, I think, would be less in places where it's hot at the same time as wet.
So the reason for that is because of the differential effect of the temperature gradient between land and sea and how that varies seasonally from mid-latitudes to low latitudes. So in this part of the world, the low pressure tends to occur over the land in the wintertime, over the land in the summertime and over the ocean in the wintertime. And that's why we get most of our precipitation coming off the ocean during the wintertime. At lower latitudes where the temperature differential, and that's because the heat storage capacity of the ocean is so much greater that it takes a lot longer for the ocean to warm up and cool than it does for the land to warm up and cool with the seasonal changes. And so that, in conjunction with us being at the junction here between the Hadley cell and the Ferrel cell, this is intrinsically a dry area, and it doesn't become wet and it doesn't become a low pressure area until the winter low pressure over the ocean creates moisture that then is vectored over land and causes our rain patterns. So, you know, these things are fairly complicated, but it is true that you know, most places that are wet, you know, the tropics, there are no deserts in the tropics, and so I mean there are relatively kind of dry forest areas, but true deserts really only occur kind of at that about 20 to 30 degrees north and south latitude, and at the poles, you know, the cold deserts. And on mountaintops, of course.
Well, I had a question if nobody else did. It looks like the Sahara in Central America are pretty much at the same latitude, aren't they? I assume that's all about the oceans. It's why they have such totally different vegetation, et cetera.
So the Sierra, the Sahara, and you know, well, I don't have the slides up now, but the Sahara and the Gobi and the Great Australian Desert, I think those are all, and in, let's see, in of course, so that is a desert that is north of the equator, of course. In North America, the deserts are less pronounced, I think, because they're interspersed with mountains. They tend to be more interspersed with mountains, and the climate in North America is very strongly influenced by the fact that the mountain ranges tend to run north and south in the New World, whereas the mountain ranges tend to run east and west in the Old World, at least in Europe and across Asia. And as a result of that, the moisture that comes in, that creates our moisture here, comes off the ocean, and a lot of that moisture is lost when it hits that first north-south mountain range, which is the Sierras. And so when you get west of the Sierras or east of the Sierras, it's actually very dry, except on the mountaintops, which are fairly moist because they're cooler, and the airflow that is generally moving from west to east, the jet stream and the airflow that generally is moving from west to east, hits those mountains, pushed up, creates a cooling effect that creates precipitation. And so you get a lot of moisture that falls on mountaintops. But in between, like in the deserts, the valleys of the Great Basin, and all the way until you get to about the Mississippi River, it's very dry. And the reason then that it becomes moist as you get to about the Mississippi River is because the moisture effect from the Gulf of Mexico, which is a warm body of water, really, and the Atlantic, start to penetrate into North America and create moisture there. You know, there's a lot of complexity and a lot of detail here. And I think if you look at, say, where do tropical rainforests occur, and you compare Africa with South America with Asia, they're basically at about the same latitudes, but the extent of them are very different. And that probably has to do a lot with both the geology, the mountain structures of those different continents, and also the distance from the ocean and the direction of moisture flow and all of that sort of thing.
Okay. Any other questions for Jim? Well, maybe we've come to the end for the day then.
Okay, well, I hope that you will all be back again a week from today, and we'll be talking about physiology and behavioral ecology. So we'll be talking a lot about looking into organisms. I'll talk some about scaling relationships, and I'll talk a lot about scaling relationships, and I'm also going to talk a lot about foraging behavior and how animals make decisions to feed on the things that they feed on, because feeding is just the most fundamental behavior of every organism on Earth. If you're not a plant, you've got to feed if you're going to live. And so what is it that causes organisms to choose to feed, where they feed, and how much they feed on? So we'll talk a lot about that, and we'll talk a lot about body size relationships too. And because that's
Thank you.
So that's what we'll do next time. Okay.
Okay.
All right. Great.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, folks.
See you
Thank
again.
you.
Terrific.
See you next.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Okay.